So welcome back for the afternoon sessions, and for those of you who are just starting out with us this afternoon, it was a little different this morning, but Karen has a method to her madness, and you have all of your seating assignments now. So I'm Dana Jelinek, and I am the Program and Outreach Manager for Grand Island Tourism. So first of all, I want to thank Nebraska Chautauqua and Humanities Nebraska for bringing this event to our community. And thank you for our travelers that are Chautauquans for being here, because Karen has come from West Virginia, so quite a distance. So this afternoon we're kicking off our afternoon session with Human Connections Through the Literature of World War I, presented by Karen Vuranch. And Karen is from West Virginia, as I said. She is a traditional storyteller as well as a Chautauqua scholar. She has portrayed Edith Wharton, which she is doing today and did last night. And then also she recreates author Pearl Buck, television cook Julia Child, pioneer author Laura Ingalls Wilder, Mother Jones, and many others. In fact, she portrays 14 different characters. So that's quite an undertaking.
Split personality, I think.
I know, my husband says as long as you can keep it straight, nobody else cares.
She storytells so she doesn't have to go to a psychiatrist.
Please don't sit in those last rows. It'll be much more complicated.
So she needs you in some of these
The one, two,
front
or
rows.
three. I'll explain first what we're doing. So when they asked me to do a workshop on the literature of World War I thought I could be a talking head. I'm a college professor. I could pontificate about literature, or we could have experiences together. So I have chosen some of my favorite works, both in poetry, diaries, letters, novels, and plays from World War I. And you have a script in your hand, and I'm the conductor. All right. So I would like to say right now, if you do not want to read, it is no problem. Just say the word pass, or no thank you, or go on. Just indicate to me you're not interested in reading. I'm not going to make someone do this, all right? But what I will do is we will go, and you'll see there's reader 1, reader 2, and we'll just go down, and I'll be the orchestrator, okay? I'll be the conductor. And get through. And what we'll do, I'll start on my right, we'll do all these rows, and then we'll do the left, and then we'll go back again, because you all have a chance to read. Okay? And it's not threatening, and it's not meant to be threatening, and if you don't want to read, please don't put yourself in a situation you're uncomfortable in. But by all means, enjoy the beautiful language of the work that was written during World War I. So, and I also have a slide that will introduce each of the pieces as well. So first I just want to say, I tell my students, I taught theater, and art imitates life. Art is what helps us, is a reaction to the world around us. And through art, we express our most deepest feelings. And that's why art appeals to us at all times. And so I want to start with poetry first. Let's see. I'm going to keep going back and forth here. So we've got World War I poetry. William Wordsworth said that poetry is a spontaneous overflow to powerful feelings. Now there are over 2,000 poets that published during World War I. So as you leave, we have another piece of paper for you that lists many, many, many other resources. I just chose my favorite ones. And of course, the obvious one is In Flanders Field. You're all familiar with that. Let me give you a little background of that. John McCrae was a doctor, a Canadian doctor, and he wrote this poem after his friend died. He was very impressed because poppies are a flower that when they aren't tended, they go dormant. But when the ground is turned up, they flower. Well, there's this terrible battle in Ypres. And after the battle's over, this bloody, horrible battle, so many died. All these flowers bloomed. And he was so touched by these flowers, not only because flowers are blooming in a place of death, but because they were red. They call red blood. And so he wrote this beautiful poem. And then there was a woman named Moina Bell Michael, who was an American woman trying to raise money for World War I vets. And she read this poem, had a spiritual moment when she read this poem, and went out and bought some paper copies and began selling them on Veterans Day, on November 11th. Today, of course, you know, the poppy is the enduring symbol of Veterans Day. So we're going to begin with this poem. Okay, like script. I've got 2 big pieces of paper here. Okay, so So we'll just start. And I think it's fairly self-explanatory. If you have questions, just say, what do you mean, Karen? So you are reader 1, you are 2, you are 3. We'll go on all the way through, and you'll all have a chance to read. So.
Tiger's field, poppies grow.
Clean the crosses, row on row.
That mark our place in the sky.
The lark still bravely singing fly.
A bird among the gods below.
All of you.
We
are the dead.
Short days ago, we lived, felt dawns, watched sunsets glow.
Lived and were loved and now we lie.
In Flanders field.
Take up our quarrel with the foe.
To you our failing hands we throw. The torch be yours to bear it high. If you bring faith, with us we die.
We shall not sleep, though poppies grow.
In Flanders field. It's such a powerful poem. You're right. There's somebody up here moving my slides so long. Okay. Another popular poet. Would you do that for me, Amy? Yes. If I did, that would be really helpful. Otherwise, I will get my steps today. I'm not sure Rudyard Kipling, of course, you all know Rudyard Kipling from the Jungle Book, and he was a short story writer, novelist, and journalist, the first to receive the Nobel Prize for Literature, and he was an unabashed imperialist. He really unabashed supported the war. The war to him was something really important, patriotism to Britain and those kinds of things. And he was one of the most important voices of the British Victorian Empire. And he wrote this first poem with me of his, which is just so part of unabashed support of the war. So where were we? You read, right? So then you are reader 1.
For all we have in our...
It's going to come back to you, okay? Because you, no, I'm sorry, stop. Okay, keep going. For all we have in our.
For all we have in our, for all our children's fate, stand up and take the war. The Hun is at the gate.
Our world has passed away, in wantonness o'erthrown. There is nothing left today but steel, fire, and stone.
Though we all know we depart, the old commandments stand. In courage keep your heart, and strength lift up your hand.
First page, second column, number 4. First page.
No easy hurdle prize shall bring us to our goal, but iron sacrifice of body, will, and soul.
There is but one task for all, one life for each to give.
Everyone, what stands if freedom's fall, what dies if England live. But sadly, Rudyard Kipling sent his son to war, and he died in, which battle did he die in? The first battle of the Somme. So his son Jack, suddenly Rudyard Kipling changes his tone. So let's read My Boy Jack. And you're going to be 1, and you're going to come back, we're going to come back to 1. No? Yeah, we'll come, be aware because we come back to you. Okay.
Ready?
Yes.
Have you news of my boy Jack?
Everyone not.
Now this side.
When do you think that he'll come back?
Now with this wind blowing at this side.
Has anyone else had word of him?
Now this side.
For what is sunk will hardly swim, not with the wind blowing, and this tide.
Oh dear, what comfort can I find?
None of this side, nor any tide.
And number 3. Shoot. Oh, 3.
Except he did not shame his kind, not even with that wind blowing and that tide.
And number 4. Send issue.
And hold your head up all the more.
This side and every tide.
Because he was the son you bore.
Engage that wind blowing and that tide.
So you can see his tone changes drastically. Suddenly he is no longer supportive of the war. He still supports the war, but he begins the realizations of loss overcomes us all. Probably the most powerful poem, anyone turn to the next one, the most powerful and most famous poem is Dulce et decorum est by Wilfred Owen. This is from a Latin phrase which translates, it is sweet and fitted to die for one's country. And Wilfred Owen was some of the best of the British poets. Sadly, he was killed in November of 1918, just 2 days before the war ended. He was killed in action 1 week before the armistice. And only 5 of his poems were published in his lifetime, but afterwards he became quite a famous poet. And his point is, there is nothing sweet, there is nothing fitting about dying. So it makes you cry. So we're going to read Don't Take Us to Storm Master. Remind me where I was. Okay, thank you. It's your turn? Okay. Read number 1.
Bent double like old beggars under sacks, knock, kneed, coughing like hags, we cursed through sludge.
Till the haunting flares we turned our backs, and towards our distant rest began to trudge.
Men marched asleep. Many had lost their boots, but limped on, bloodshod. All went lame, all blind.
Drunk with fatigue, deaf even to the hoots of gas shells dropping softly behind.
Gas, gas, quick boys, an ecstasy of fumbling, fitting the clumsy helmets just in time.
But someone still was yelling out and stumbling, and clamoring like a man in fire or light.
The gas is very green. Number 7.
Dim through the misty panes and thick green light, as under a green seat I saw him drowning.
In all my dreams before my helpless sight, he plunges at me, guttering, choking, drowning.
If in some smoldering flames you too can pace behind the wagons that we flung in.
And watch the white eyes writhing in his face, his hanging face, like a devil sick of sin.
You could hear at every jolt the blood converging from the front.
Obscene as cancer, bitter as the cut of vile incurable sores on innocent tongues.
My friend, you would not tell with such high zest, do children pardon for some desperate memory, the old lie.
Dulce et decorum est pro patria more. Suddenly, as the war begins to take its toll, and hopefully you all heard last night the incredible loss, the war brought so many new kinds of technology that the generals weren't prepared to deal with, and the huge losses. And one of those technologies was the noxious gases, the mustard gases, that the Germans used first, and then quickly the British were able to find some, and it was one of the really terrible outcomes of the war that blinded and left men the rest of their lives incapacitated to breathe, but many died at the moment, and this, I think, poem really captures the horror of that. Okay, now, so these are the kind of poems that are being written by the men on the field. Meanwhile, there's all sorts of patriotic things being written. And War Girls by Jessie Pope is probably a complete change from this. People were, the Wilfred Owen dedicated his poem that we just read to this woman as a satire because of what she was saying about the war. Yeah, the women's, this is a British. We had the wax was our World War II. We did have women's scores as well. I also do a workshop on women in World War I. We know how many men died and how many men were wounded. We know how many horses died. Nowhere is it written how many women participated in the war. No one knows. It's a thesis weight man, not like me, somebody. All right, you begin with Jessie Pope, please.
There's the girl who takes your ticket for the train.
Am I here? Is this where I am? Yeah. Okay. And then we go back here.
And the girl who speeds the lift from floor to floor.
It's the girl who does a milk round in the rain, and the girl who calls for orders at your door.
And we're back to the beginning. You're back there.
Strong, sensible, and fit.
There's out to show their grit.
Yes. And tackle jobs with energy and knack. No longer caged and penned up.
They're going to keep their end up.
Till the khaki soldier boys come marching back.
There's a motor girl who drives a heavy van.
There's the butcher girl who brings your joint of meat.
There's the girl who cries, "All fares, please," like a man.
And the girl who whistles taxis up the street.
Beneath each uniform.
Please say a heart that's soft and warm.
Let's see then. If you're in the green.
Though of canny mother wit they show no lack,
Well, the song statement, this is.
Leave no time for love and kisses.
Till the baggy soldier boys come marching back. So you see, when Wilfred Owen dedicated Dolce and Citrones to this woman, he was doing this this is not worthless. So there's really several things happening with poets at this time. This one thing exonerating, exalting patriotism. And another thing that happens during World War I, you don't think about this, but one of the causes of the war was the new concept of nationalism. We suddenly are, I'm German, I'm American, I'm English. That was a new concept. Think about the Civil War. Think about, I'll tell you the person from my state, Stonewall Jackson, hated slavery, but he joined the Confederacy because he was a Virginian before he was an American, right? So, and what happens with the Industrial Revolution is people are now suddenly, we have high schools, we have middle class. And what do we teach? We taught everything in K-8. What do we teach in high school? American history. And as we near the 1900s, suddenly the concept of nationalism takes over worldwide, and we are proud of our country. This is a modern concept, which just kind of blows my mind. That this is something that's not, this is a 19th century, 20th century concept to be proud of our own nation before our county or our community or our church or our state. So this was one of the contributions to the war, is this sense of nationalism across the world. So you have this dichotomy between Jesse Pope and Wilfred Owen. Let's see. The next thing I want to talk about, another dichotomy in our nation, of course, is the African-American experience. Amy, if you give me, oh, there she is. Georgia Douglas Johnson was an important Renaissance poet, and she at the peak of her popularity, she was the most widely read black poet in America. But I show you the picture of Henry Johnson, who was one of the Harlem Hellfighters, which I spoke of last night, the ones that saved Paris, the ones who came in, and he was really an important leader in that group. And when he came home, he was recruited by the American government to recruit African Americans for the war effort, especially World War II. And finally, at one point he says, you know what? We weren't treated that great. So what do? They arrest him, take his uniform, and put him in jail. What? That's what happened to Henry Johnson. So he dies penniless. So it's part of the fact that we needed all populations to help us, but we didn't treat them as fairly as possible. But let's read Georgia Douglas Johnson's poem, just a short one, and you begin.
The hour is big with sooth and son, with errant men of war.
While blood of the alien, friend and foe, imbues the land afar.
And we with sable faces pent, move with the vanguard line.
Shod with the faith of springtime peaks and all the stars opine.
So that is George Douglas Johnson.
Any idea how many were in the Harlem Hellfighters?
How many soldiers were in the Harlem Hellfighters? It was a full platoon. And how many's in a platoon? Is there a military person in the room? I'm in a company. And one of their other claims to fame is they never had a man taken as a prisoner of war. They never lost a man to the Germans. They lost men dying, but they never lost a man. They were absolutely, and the other thing that happened is when they arrived, Blackjack Pershing said, gave the French said, we want men to help us in our line. Our men, we've lost so many. And Blackjack Pershing says, take the African American soldiers. And suddenly they were being treated equal. It was just an overwhelming experience because the French were so happy to have them and brought them in. And again, also Robert Europe was the leader of the jazz band that played with the Harlem Hellfighters. There were actually 3 or 4 companies of men, and really, that's my phrase: jazz conquered Europe the way no German army ever could. And it really did happen that the African Americans were treated very well in Europe, and when they came back home, they were not treated well. They were lynched for wearing their uniforms in the South and all sorts of really horrible things. I'm looking for page 4. Here's page 4. All right, one more. The war film. So this is a British woman, and she wrote. And much of the work that we're going to read today comes after the war. When you're in this war, who is time to write? So one of the things that it is a reaction to what they did. And I want to just give you a little background to this. I love this poem. This is probably her most famous poem. She wrote it after seeing the film Mons. Mons, of course, was a town in Belgium. And what happened was, it was one of the early battles, and the Germans had 2 million men in their army, and the French had 1 million men in their army, and the British had 100,000. And the Kaiser called the British a contemptible little army, so they called themselves the Old Contemptibles. But the difference is those 100,000 men were seasoned soldiers, and they turned the battle at Mons. There's a story about Mons about how they were running from the German, they had to turn around because again, there were only 100,000 of them, and a great ghost of a horse rises up, St. Michael on his horse, to save the army and saves them. Of course, that's been disproven, but that was part of the story of the Mons battle. But what was amazing is that these British held so strong at Mons when it was against such odds. So where are we? Remind me where we are. Becky. Becky.
I saw with a catch of breath and the hearts uplifting, sorrow and pride, the week's great draw.
That's the movie, a British version for the movie. The movie that's drawing people into the theater. Okay.
The Mon Retreat.
No, oh yeah. Do we go here? Yeah. We go here? Yeah, I think it's, yeah, I'm sorry, yeah.
The Mon Retreat, the old contemptibles who fought and died, the horror, the anguish, and the glory.
As in a dream, still hearing machine guns rattle and shells scream, I came out into the street.
When the day was done, my little son wondered at bath time why I kissed him so much, naked upon my knee.
We are on page 4, top of the, oh, some of them got it, okay.
5.
Okay,
How could he know the sudden terror that assaulted me, the body I had borne, 9 moons beneath my heart, part of me.
If someday it should be taken away to war, tortured, torn, slain, rotting in no man's land out in the rain, my little son.
How should he know why I kissed and kissed and kissed him, crooning his name? He thought that I was daft. He thought it was a game and laughed and laughed.
And that juxtaposition of her worried about the sun and the sun not understanding is really powerful. So poetry, of course, again, there are thousands and thousands of World War I poets, and I hope that you read more of them. That was a smattering. Let's move on now to novels. Amy? One more. I have it in? Yes, we're in. Okay, yes, there we go. And of course, the most remarkable novel of the war, I'm sure you're more than all familiar with, is All Quiet on the Western Front. Erich Maria Remarque was a soldier during the war, a German veteran, and he describes this terrible thing of being a soldier in the trench. And actually, when his book was published in 1929, it was banned in Germany. And there was a sequel that was banned as well. The 1930s movie made with Lou Ayres became a really important movie in the 30s. And because of this movie, Lou Ayres becomes a conscientious objector in World War II. Because it's really from the point of view of the soldier slogging through the mud. So I picked out just a very few passages of this, just a couple to give you an idea. You can't read it, we can't do a whole novel. I'm so sorry to say. Okay, you want to? Did you read your book?
This book is to be neither an accusation nor a confession, and at least of all an adventure, for death is not an adventure to those who stand face to face with it. It will try simply to tell of a generation of men who, even though they may have escaped shells, were destroyed by the war.
Okay.
We're no longer young men. We've lost any desire to conquer the world. We are refugees. We are fleeing from ourselves, from our lives. We were 18 years old, and we had just begun to love the world and to love being in it, but we had to shoot at it. The first shell to land went straight for our hearts. We've been cut off from real action, from getting on, from progress. We don't believe in those things anymore. We believe in the war.
It is very clear that the unhappiness of the world is so often brought on by small men.
The Kaiser was supposed to be very short.
At school, nobody ever taught us how to light a cigarette in a strong flame, or how a fire could be made with wet wood, or and it's best to stick a bayonet in the belly because there it doesn't get jammed as it does in the ribs.
Just you consider, almost all of us are simple folk. And in France, too, the majority of men are laborers, workmen, or clerks. Now, just why would a French blacksmith or a French shoemaker want to attack us? No, it is merely the rulers. I had never seen a Frenchman before I came here, and it will be just the same with the majority of Frenchmen as regards us. They weren't asked about it any more than we were.
But now, for the first time, I see you are a man like me. I thought of your hand of grenades, of your bayonet, of your rifle. Now I see your wife and your face in our fellowship. Forgive me, comrade. We always see it too late. Why do they never tell us that you are poor devils like us, that your mothers are just as anxious as ours, and that we have the same fear of death, and the same dying, and the same agony? Forgive me, comrade. How could you be my
He fell in October 1918 on a day that was so quiet and still on the whole front that the Army report confined itself to a single sentence. All quiet on the Western Front. He had fallen forward and lay on the earth as though sleeping. Turning him over, one saw that he could not have suffered long. His face had an expression of calm, as though almost glad the end had come.
And if you call the movie, that was a very poignant moment. He's in the trench, nothing's happening, and a butterfly floats up, and he reaches to grab the butterfly, and that's when he shot. So that movie has been remade, by the way, with Richard Thomas of the Waltons, and it's equally as powerful, I would think. Okay, Amy, thank you. The next one we have is Ernest Hemingway, Farewell to Arms. Hemingway wrote a number of stories about the war. He was a novelist, short story writer, journalist, and America does not enter the war until 1917, and so many American men went over and became ambulance drivers because they so believed in the cause of the war, and he was one of them. And so he became an ambulance driver. This book, Farewell to Arms, is somewhat autobiographical about an ambulance driver that gets hurt, and then he meets a nurse, and they run away together. And but anyway, his image of being the strong, writer, brought him admiration. He was awarded the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1954, and many of his works are considered classics. So let's begin with Ernest Hemingway, and I forget where we are. You, thank you, sir. You have to remind me.
There were many words that you could not stand to hear, and finally, only the names of places had dignity. Certain numbers were the same way, and certain dates, and these, with the names of the places, were all you could say, and have them mean anything. Abstract words such as glory, honor, courage, or hallow were obscene beside the concrete names of villages, the numbers of roads, the names of rivers, the numbers of regiments, and the dates.
Perhaps wars weren't won anymore. Maybe they went on forever. Maybe it was another 100 years old.
Even the peasants know better than to believe in a war. Everybody hates war. There's a class that controls the country that is stupid, do not realize anything, and never can. That is why we have this war. Also, they make money out of it.
The world rages anyway, and afterward, many are strong at the broken places. For those that will not break, it kills. It kills the very good, the very gentle, and the very brave impartiality. If you are none of these, be sure it will kill you too, but there will be no special hurry.
I believe that all the people who stand to profit by a war and who help provide it, provoke it, should be shot on the first day it starts by accredited representatives of the loyal citizens of the country who will fight it.
And that's Ernest Hemingway's Take the Door. Okay, Amy. Next, now you all know this lovely lady. This is, of course, someone very special to Nebraska, Lily Cather. She won the Pulitzer Prize for one of ours, in, I think it was 23, in the middle of the notes. Yeah, she published it in 22 and one in 23. And it's the story of a young Nebraska boy who goes to the war and, of course, dies in the battle. It was actually her cousin, Claude Wheeler, and she wrote the story of her cousin. It was not her intention for the book to be a war novel. In fact, the first 2/3 of his life is his experience as a farmer in Nebraska, and the last third is the war. But the book was severely criticized, and you'll see, Sinclair Lewis especially said the Nebraska parts were true, but the war was overly romanticized. She has a little of the Jessie Pope in her, romanticizing the war, and Hemingway really spares the book. The book's a very powerful book, I think, about the local farmer, the local American going to war and the experience of it. It's valuable that way. So let's begin. I think we're back with you, your Lily Kavner number 1.
While Claude was watching for dinner, Molly came to him with page of newspaper cartoons illustrating Germans' brutality. Mr. Claude, she asked, how come all hidden Germans is such ugly-looking people? The owners and the German folk around here ain't ugly looking. Claude put off her indulgently. Maybe it's the ugly ones who are doing the fighting, and the ones at home are nice, like our neighbors.
Because of course the issue in Nebraska was there were so many German Americans. So many, my grandfather was German American living in St. Louis, and they received a great deal of prejudice because of their last name, Fishhorn. German name. So that was one of the, again, another issue happening in America.
Ernest was offended and did not come back for nearly a month. Not indeed until the announcement that Germany would assume unrestricted submarine warfare made everyone look questionably at his neighbor.
Most of them shared his chaotic ideas. They had come together from farms and shops and mills and mines, boys from college and boys from tough joints in big cities, sheep herders, streetcar drivers, plumbers' assistants, billiard makers.
But they all came to give and not to ask, and what they offered was just themselves, their big red hands, their strong backs, the steady, honest look in their eyes.
Claude loved the men he trained with, wouldn't choose to live in any better company.
3 years ago, he used to sit moping by the window because he couldn't see how a Nebraska farmer boy had and called, or indeed any way to throw himself into the struggle in France. But then the miracle happened, and now the feeling of faithful purpose was strong in his breast.
Now the bullets began popping around him. 2 rattled on his tin hat. 1 caught him in the shoulder. The blood dripped down on his coat, but he felt no weakness. He only felt one thing, that he commanded wonderful men. When David came up with supports, he might find them dead, but he would find them all there. They were there to stay until they were carried out to be buried. They were mortal, but they were unconquerable.
She reads Claude's letters over and over again, and it reassures herself. For him, the call was clear. The cause was glorious. Never a doubt stained his bright faith. He tried to believe in his own country better than it is, in France better than any country can be. And those were beautiful beliefs tonight.
So you can see how the people, the Wilfred Owens of the world, found that to be a bit romanticized. But at the same time, I think it really does capture the sense of the average soldier that went there, and the sense that we were all, and the problem with German Americans and having that problem. Okay, Amy. Now we have person near to my house. My hair doesn't look like hers at all, does it? But that's an older picture. That's a picture from the early 1900s. I was doing her in 1930. All right, so I don't need to talk too much about her because, of course, you all heard about her last night. She was an expatriate living in Paris, a fairly affluent woman, no, a very affluent woman, and a very successful novelist at the time. I mean, she was, her books brought in a great deal of money. Henry James would say, with Edith Wharton's last book, she bought an automobile. With my last book, I bought a handcart. With the next book, I'll buy the can of paint. So she really did. She also had several books made into movies, silent movies, because that's the time period, but as a result, she was financially successful. But when the war came, of course, as you heard last night, she threw herself into the war effort. My favorite book of hers is one called A Son at the Front, and it was written in 23, so we are going to be passages of that. I believe you're next.
What did it mean and what must it feel like for parents in a safe, nationalized modern world to be suddenly saying to each other with white lips, a son in the war?
Hampton's lips were open to reply when her face changed, and he saw that he had ceased to exist for her. He knew the reason. That look came over everybody's face nowadays at the hour when the evening paper came. At that hour, everywhere over the globe, business and labor and pleasure that still existed were suspended for a moment, while the hearts of all men gathered themselves up in a question and a prayer.
There was enough misery and confusion at the rear for every civilian volunteer to find this task.
War had turned out to be so immeasurably more hideous and abominable than those who most abhorred war had dreamed it could be.
Remembering views of no man's land, wherever he went, he pursued by visions of that land of doom. Visions of fathomless mud, rant-haunted trenches, freezing nights under the sleety sky, men dying in barbed wire between the lines, or crawling out to save a comrade and being shattered to death on the return.
His commanding officer reported him as wounded and missing. The words had taken on a hideous significance in the last months, freezing to death between the lines, mutilation and torture, or weeks of slow agony in German hospitals.
After attending a party, it's queer, he said, all these people who have forgotten the war suddenly made me remember it.
There was heavy news from Verdun, where east to west the air was dark with calamity. But she triumphed in the fact that her boy was at Verdun, when he might have been at the Somme, where things that were stagnant were on the whole going less well. Mothers prayed for a quiet sector, and then what happened? The men grew careless. Your son was ordered out to see the repairs to the barbed wire entanglement, and a sharpshooter picked him off while you were sitting reading one of the letters and thinking, thank God he's out of the fighting.
The weeks thus punctuated by private anxieties rolled on dark with doom. At last, in December, came the victory of Verdun. Men took it reverently, but soberly. The price paid had been too heavy for rejoicing, and the horizon was too ominous in other quarters.
And still the flood of war rolled on, success here, failure there, the menace of disaster. Through all this, alternating of tragedy and triumph, ran the million individual threads of hope, fear, fortitude, resolve, in which the fortune of war was obscurely but faithfully interwoven.
And I don't know if you recognize any of those lines, but much of my World War I piece in Edith is taken from this book. And last night I tried to do as much of her words as I could, just connecting. So let's move on. Another important category of literature is the journals and diaries of the war, and the number, especially, this was really a woman's prerogative. The men were busy fighting, but the women were ambulance drivers and were nurses and were able to keep diaries in a way that the men weren't as much. And so Mildred Aldrich is our first one. She wrote letters between June 3rd and September 8th, and they were very, very popular in America. She was awarded the Legion of Honor by the Friends, and her books, as well as Edith's, were really the books that helped to convince America they had to join the war. So we just have one very short notice from Mildred. Yes.
The sensation was uncanny. Out there in the northeast still boomed the cannon. The smoke of the battle still rose straight in the still air. I had seen the war. I had watched its destructive bombs. For 3 days, its cannon had pounded on every nerve in my body. But none of the horror it had sowed from the eastern frontier of Belgium to within 4 miles of me had reached me, except in the form of a threat. Yet out there on the plain, almost within my sight, lay men who had paid with their lives, each dear to someone, to hold back the battle from Paris. and incidentally, from me.
Next one, Mason Clare was, the Monroe Company had 2 ambulances and 4 drivers. He was a guy from England that sent them over, and he had, so 2 of the women were very colorful women, but Mason Clare was one of them. She was, just active in women's suffrage as well, so she would read the Mason Clare bit.
It is all unspeakably beautiful, and it comes to me with the natural, inevitable shock and ecstasy of beauty. I am going straight into the horror of war. For all I know, it may be anywhere, here, behind this century, or there, beyond that line of a willow. I don't know. I don't care. I cannot realize it. All that I can see or feel is the beauty. I look and look so that I may remember it. It is possible I am enjoying myself.
And that is something else I want to do. There's one more, there's many, many emotions and things that happened, but women especially found themselves in the heat of battle, driving an ambulance, never had this feeling of being so needed. And even though it was horrible, and it was muddy, and it was terrible, and it was bloody, the excitement of it. You know, the same thing that happened is that so many Vietnam vets, when they come home, became ambulance drivers in America. And before that, ambulance drivers just drove fast. Suddenly, Vietnam vets are triaging. And the doctors are saying, how did this happen? Well, I triaged in Vietnam, I could do it here. They change things because of that energy and excitement that you feel in war. And so we're talking about a lot of the negativity, aren't we? But there is that aspect as well. And that's why I chose that one particular passage. Now go on to Flora Sandys, was an English woman sergeant in the Serbian army. She was a British woman, and she was a doctor as well. She became a member of she went with the St. John Ambulance Volunteer Corps to Serbia and becomes enrolled in the army. She's decorated with 7 medals. She marries a fellow officer, a former Russian White Army general, and eventually lives in Serbia the rest of her life. But her story is quite interesting. Let's start with Flora.
All the patients were to go off that afternoon. The question of transport is always a terrible problem. In many cases, the bullock wagons are the only things that can stand the rough tracks. Imagine yourself with a shattered leg, lying in company with 3 or 4 others on the floor of a springless bullock wagon, jolting like that for 20 or 30 miles. We used to get in big batches of wounded who had traveled like that for 3 or 4 days, straight from the front.
And then she joins the army, actually.
Fighting on Mount Chuckus, I met 3 officers running in the same direction. The officers hesitated about letting me come and said, well, can you run fast? They said, what? Away from the Bulgars? I exclaimed in surprise. No, towards them. Yes, of course I can. Well, come on then. And off we went.
Though no one had the breath to tell me where we were going, it was plain enough, as we could hear the firing more clearly every moment. We finally came to a ruined hut where we found the commander of the battalions. The Bulgarians had seemed to have gotten their artillery fairly close, and the shrapnel was bursting thickly all around.
The officer in charge showed me how to fire off one of the guns when he gave the word and let me take the place of the man who had been doing it.
The firing died down and dark, and we left the firing line and made innumerable campfires and sat around them. The commander took me into his company, and I was enrolled in his books, and he seemed to think I might be a corporal pretty soon if I behaved myself.
And the last diary I want to talk about are these 2 women, Addie Hunton and Catherine Johnson. And let's see, I'm trying to juggle my notes and the script because it's an easy task. In case you want Addie. Catherine was from Ohio. They were both suffragists, activists, they were teachers, and Addie Hunton becomes the first woman to graduate from the Spencer College of Commerce, and they get involved with the National Association of Colored Women and the YWCA, who are sending women over to work. And of course, you have these African American troops that are looking for women to go do the nursing and deliver mail, and they've kept the forces segregated, so the white women are helping white soldiers and the black women helping black soldiers. But these two women spent a great deal of time, and we'll begin. You want to pass, right? Okay. And you were the first woman reader for Addie and
The American forces already in France were calling not only for our help, but haste. Suddenly, we found ourselves included in this call.
One dark afternoon, the buzz of the telephone at our elbow told us that our time had come. We asked no questions, for those were days of deep secrecy, but looked for the last time at the war map in the office, studied it as never before, wondering where in that war-wrecked country across the Atlantic we would find our place of service.
The many ports of France were particularly the home of the colored soldiers, so that landing in Bordeaux, it did not seem strange to be greeted by our own men. But it did seem passing strange that we should see them guarding German prisoners. Somehow we felt that the colored soldiers found it rather refreshing, having come from a country where it seemed nobody's business to be guarding them.
All honor is due the faithful men and women of both races who, by a great expenditure of time, money, and energy, made possible the operation of the great plan of bringing comfort and relief to the soldiers. And while there were prejudices and discriminations often shown to the colored race, and sometimes injustices to the soldiers of both races, still the Army would have been a barren place had these institutions not existed.
It was our privilege to help in 100 different ways. Men who were groping and discouraged, others who were crying loudly for help. We desired all innocence of heart to serve whatever colored regiments were marshaled to battle against the foe.
Those who were facing the shot and shell,
The poison gas and liquid flame.
the bombs from above,
Who were struggling through barbed wire entanglements and sleeping in trenches and dugouts.
Who were suffering in all possible ways from the wicked ingenuity of the Germans.
Who for days went without food and drink.
Who offered themselves as a supreme sacrifice to help to make the world safe for democracy.
we are going to be them.
But to our liberty and the joy of this service was ever present, with its awful toll of death and suffering. And then the service of the colored welfare workers was more or less clouded at times with that biting, stinging thing which is ever shadowing us in our country.
There were splendid men among both secretaries and Army and office officials who honestly and actively opposed discrimination.
And so journals become an important way for us to have first-hand accounts of what's happening. Now, I have to tell you, we're probably running low on time. I'm going to summarize the next bit, because there's one thing I want to end with, okay? So the next, you can take this, you can have this. This is my gift to you, okay? It's a very short play, but we won't read it right now. But it's the story of the Christmas truce. And I don't know if you know this story, but in 1914, the very first Christmas, there were German soldiers and English soldiers on Christmas Eve in the lines. And the Germans began to sing, Tannenbaum, and the English are singing it, That's Day Fidelis. And they say, let's have a truce. They show white flags, and the English go out and go, and they come out that night, and they share stories, and cigars, and cigarettes, and exchange addresses even. And there's this sense of, why are we fighting each other? And the next day, they call it football, we call it soccer. They play a game of soccer. And there's this coming together, and the powers that be are appalled. Oh my, how can we keep them fighting each other if they're playing soccer together? But it was really an event that happened. I had to be fortunate to go to Belgium and do a tour because of my interest in this and saw the place where it happened. And it's really a magical story of people overcoming the horror of war and coming together. So I'm going to let you read that on your own, and I'm going to end with, I want to talk about there's so many films. Wikipedia, I can come up here now with Amy. Or you can go ahead and do it. I'll let you down. I'll let you down here. So I just want to bring to your attention, there's so many films that bring this war to life. And I want to show you the posters and a few of them. So of course, recently, 1917, which was a Golden Globes winner, and really captures the story of two young men in the war, and that's a fairly recent movie. I haven't really seen all of them. I want to talk about The Great War, which is the story of the Harlem Hellfires, and it was 2019. Some not as big names. It didn't get great reviews. It's a little bit ponderous, but it is the story of the black soldiers, and so I encourage you to watch that one as well. They Shall Not Grow Old was recently a documentary of Peter Jackson. He took the original footage from 1918 and updated it with contemporary technology, so it looks contemporary. It is really powerful. It's a little hard to watch because it's contemporary footage of the war, and it came out just a few years ago, and it's really brilliant. Okay, War Horse, I love this. It was a play, first of all things. And the movie, I think, is even more powerful about a young English boy who has this horse, and the horse is taken. Of course, I told you, 1 million horses were killed during the war. They just worked it to death. And his horse had a great heart, and the boy finds his horse, and the horse finds his way. Oh, it's so wonderful. My Boy Jack was I think it was a made-for-TV movie with the story of, we discussed this one, Richard Kipling's son, and Daniel Radford of Harry Potter fame plays Jack Kipling. The Lost Battalion, one of my all-time favorites. Ricky Schroeder played the Lost Battalion was neither Lost nor Battalion. But in 1918, they were told, they gathered these people from they were American different forces, and told to go fight this fight. And the young man who was a lawyer, who was the head of the company, said, it's a suicide mission. They said, don't be flanked by French. Well, the French was said suicide and left. And so he goes in, gets trapped by this German, they're in the Chateau Thiers woods, and they're just decimated. The German are taking him off. He sends his pigeon, his last pigeon, he sends back. The pigeon gets shot and makes it back home to tell the British and America where they are. And finally they get saved. And because of them, they held the Germans off long enough that the Americans could break the German line. It's just a beautiful story, really, really wonderful story. Thanks. Africa the Queen, you don't think of this being a World War I story. You know, it's one of the greatest movies of all time. But they are ousted from she's a missionary with her brother, and the Germans come in and take over their village. And she has to escape with this sort of road, a riverboat guy helps her escape, and she's this uptight Christian woman, uptight spinster, I should say. Not that Christian women are uptight, but she's uptight. Until she meets him, she gets uptight, and they go and they end up bombing a German boat. It's being successful. So it's one of the best movies of all time. Lawrence of Arabia, of course. We forget the fact that the Middle East was part of the war theater, and that with the French and the English especially, we helped encourage the Arabs to fight alongside, to overcome the Turks. And a young Englishman, Lawrence, who became known as Lawrence of Arabia, who paid by Peter O'Toole, rise with Faisal, and they turn the tide. And promises are made to the Arabs that they'll have their own countries. And of course, all those promises are broken, as I mentioned last night with this last speaker agreement. There were several versions of All Quiet on the Western Front. I've mentioned both of those already. Sergeant York is another oldie but really goodie with Gary Cooper. York was a Tennessee young man who had found God and said, I'm going to be a conscientious objector. And they said, oh, you're just wussy, you don't want to fire a gun. And then they found out he is this amazing crack shot. And he single-handedly captures a German battalion and brings in 133 men. Yes.
Is that movie going to be released?
Yeah, 2041.
Oh, when is it going to be released? 2041. 2041. That's the wrong date. I don't have my dates. It was a 30s movie. I don't know what it is. Anyway, 1941. I'm sorry. I was going to fast. We're not there. The first movie to ever win the Best Oscar was a movie called Wings. And it won in 1927. Actually, it was the first year they had the Oscars. They gave 2 Oscars, one to a black and white movie, and one to a movie that was a silent, and one to this one. And but this was considered to be the first movie to win. They actually used Jimmy Doolittle, who was a fledgling pilot then. He was a World War II ace. He helped out with it, and they used actual American planes. But no one liked the guy who made the movies they didn't invite to the party. I think that's it. Okay, and then there will, as you leave, we'll give you a list. There's a list of many more movies and poems and novels to read, because it just goes on and on to explore. We don't know enough about World War I. There are many historians that don't say there's a one and a two. They call it the long war theories, that there just was 20 years hiatus between one and war, because that's truly what Edith and the others who were living in town realized. So read about World War I, talk about it. Do you want any questions before we go? Yes.
I can see in the poetry and the novels that the pro and the lamenting part were counterposed.
Yeah.
When I think of the music of that period, I always think of the upbeat side.
Well, there you go. Yeah.
Was there a downbeat side?
Oh, sure, there were songs about, about losing men and stuff. And I was doing literature, I wasn't doing art, so I didn't get into the music at all. But certainly there were songs that were lamenting losing a loved one, or, till you come home again kind of things. I don't know the music as well as I know World War II music, I'll be singing. So there's certainly, art is how we express how we feel about something. And but certainly jazz music comes about.
The library will be closing in 45 minutes at 3 o'clock. If you need to call ahead for a ride, get assistance, or apply for a library card, please do so now.
Any other questions?
Computers, scanning, faxing, and printing services in the study room will become unavailable 10 minutes before we close.
Oh, okay, so could you go back, Amy, to that one? I gotta tell you, this is my 5th Chautauqua this summer, okay? So I'm trying to get my ducks in a row. That's why the date was wrong, and that's why the Great War, I thought I had added it, and I'm sorry, I guess I have. I think I said some updates, but, so the Great War, yes.
I love that you talked about the poetry. Do you all remember the Garth Brooks song about Bella Wood? Was that the...
Bella Wood, yes, I'm Lost Italian. It is really, in that movie, unfortunately, I could only find on YouTube a really grainy version of it. Boy, I love that movie. It was really well done. Ricky Schroeder is a lovely job. And then he comes back, Ricky Schroeder, and he's a hero. And he says, I'm not a hero, I brought people to their death. And he's blowing in parades and said he can hardly get his law practice doing because people kidnap Ricky Schroeder again, the guy in this movie. And he can hardly get his work done because people treat him like a hero. And he gets very depressed about it. And I'm sad to say he doesn't commit suicide because of that. Because I appreciate it.
Okay, so we're going to wrap it up.
Okay.
You need to breathe.
Okay. I have my exercise though today.
So we thank you, Karen. Let's give her a round of applause.